I used to believe the worst moment in a father's life was hearing a judge say you've lost your child. But I was wrong. The worst moment is realizing your own son might be the reason it happens. The airport was loud that morning, rolling suitcases scraping across tile, coffee machines hissing, the overhead speaker announcing flights every few seconds. But when the officer's hand landed on my shoulder, everything seemed to go quiet. "Sir, you're not boarding that plane today." I turned around thinking it had to be a mistake. My boarding pass was already in my hand, gate B12 glowing just 30 yards ahead, the plane to Chicago boarding in 10 minutes. That hearing in Chicago was the most important appointment of my life. Miss it, and the judge could finalize custody without me even in the room. 17 years of raising my son could disappear in a single decision. "There must be some confusion," I told the officer, trying to stay calm. "I've learned in life that losing your temper never fixes anything." He didn't look angry, just professional, the way someone looks when they're following instructions they didn't write. "We received a report that you may be attempting to leave the state before a scheduled custody hearing." I blinked at him. For a second I thought maybe Melissa had filed something new in court again. My ex-wife had been throwing paperwork at me for months. Motions, accusations, requests for full custody. Every week it felt like another envelope from her lawyer landed in my mailbox. "Who reported that?" I asked. The officer hesitated for just a second before answering. "Your son." The word hit harder than anything else he could have said. My son. Ethan Carter. 16 years old. The kid whose baseball games I never missed. The kid I taught to drive in an empty mall parking lot when he was 14. The kid who used to fall asleep on the couch during movie nights with his head on my shoulder. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I just stared at the officer, trying to understand how those two words could exist in the same sentence as my name. "That can't be right," I said quietly. But the officer was already speaking into his radio. "We just need you to come with us for a moment, sir." For a moment. The problem was I didn't have a moment. I glanced up at the giant digital clock above the security checkpoint. 8:12 a.m. The hearing in Chicago started at 10 o'clock. Even with the 1-hour flight, I was cutting it close. If I didn't board in the next few minutes, the judge would call the case without me. Melissa's lawyer would stand there, shake his head, and tell the court I had chosen not to show up. And just like that, the story would write itself. The irresponsible father. The unstable parent. The man who didn't care enough to be present. Except I was there. 30 yards from my gate. And suddenly it felt like the distance between me and that airplane might as well have been 3,000 miles. I followed the officer through a side door near the security checkpoint, while travelers kept moving toward their gates like nothing unusual was happening. The hallway behind the glass walls felt strangely quiet compared to the noise of the terminal. A small office waited at the end with a metal desk, 2 chairs, and a clock ticking loudly on the wall. The officer gestured for me to sit. I checked my watch. 8:15 in the morning. Every minute now felt like someone slowly closing a door in front of me. "This will only take a moment," he said, but moments were exactly what I could not afford. I kept thinking about the courtroom in Chicago, about the long table where Melissa and her lawyer would already be preparing their statements. Her attorney had a reputation for turning small details into powerful arguments. If I did not walk into that courtroom myself, they would not even need to argue very hard. The judge would look at the empty chair where I should be sitting and the story would write itself. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Officer, I have a custody hearing in less than 2 hours. My flight leaves in 10 minutes. There has to be some mistake." He nodded slightly, like he had heard that kind of sentence before. "We just need to clarify a report we received. Once we verify everything, you will be free to go." Clarify. The word sounded harmless. But harmless things can still cost you everything when the clock is running. He opened a folder and glanced down at a printed report. "Your son, Ethan Carter, contacted authorities this morning. He stated you might be planning to leave before the hearing." Hearing my son's name again made something tighten in my chest. Ethan was not the kind of kid who called the police. He was the kid who used to text me pictures of his lunch at school or send me videos of his baseball practice. I remembered helping him with his math homework just a few months earlier at the kitchen table while we argued about which professional team had the best pitching lineup. That was not the kind of kid who reported his own father. Did he say why he believed that? I asked quietly. The officer scanned the paper again. He said you mentioned traveling this morning and that he was concerned you might not attend the hearing. For a second I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about the situation. Of course I mentioned traveling. I had told Ethan about the flight 3 days earlier when we had dinner together. I told him I was flying to Chicago so I could be in the courtroom and fight for time with him. I even joked that I would probably drink terrible airport coffee while waiting at the gate. That conversation suddenly replayed in my head, every detail sharper than before. Ethan had listened quietly that night, nodding while he pushed fries around his plate. At the time I thought he was just tired from school. Now I wondered if something else had been on his mind. The clock on the wall ticked to 8:18. Somewhere out in the terminal, passengers were probably lining up to board my plane. And while I sat in that small airport office, trying to understand how my own son's words had put me here, a quiet thought started forming in the back of my mind, a thought I did not want to believe but could not ignore. Ethan did not invent this story on his own. Someone had helped him. I sat in that small airport office staring at the clock as the second hand moved forward one quiet click at a time. 8:21 in the morning. Somewhere out there my flight was probably boarding. People were showing their boarding passes, placing bags in overhead bins, settling into seats while a flight attendant gave the usual safety speech. I imagined the empty seat that should have been mine. I imagined the plane pulling away from the gate without me. The officer across the desk watched me carefully but did not seem hostile. He simply looked like someone following a checklist. "When did your son make the report?" I asked. He glanced down again at the paperwork. "Approximately 30 minutes ago." 30 minutes. That meant Ethan had made the call after I was already on my way to the airport. The timing felt too perfect. Too convenient. I leaned back slightly in the chair and tried to keep my breathing steady. 17 years of raising a kid teaches you many things, including how to read the difference between a mistake and something planned. Ethan was not careless with his words. Even as a little boy he used to pause before answering questions, thinking carefully about what he wanted to say. I remembered one afternoon when he was 8 years old, and his teacher called because another kid had blamed him for breaking a classroom projector. When I asked Ethan about it that night, he did not panic or deny anything immediately. He simply looked at me and said, "Dad, if I did something wrong I would tell you." He had always been that kind of kid. Honest almost to a fault. That memory made the situation feel even stranger. The officer spoke again, pulling me back to the present. "Did you inform your son about your travel plans today?" "Yes," I answered. "I told him 3 days ago. I said I was flying to Chicago so I could attend the hearing." The officer nodded slowly. "Did you say anything about leaving afterward?" I shook my head. "Leaving where?" "I have a job here. My house is here. My life is here." He made a small note on the paper. The clock reached 8:23. I pictured the judge in Chicago reviewing the case file. Melissa's attorney probably standing beside her with that calm, confident smile he always wore during hearings. They had been building their case for months. Every small disagreement between Melissa and me had been turned into another document, another complaint, another argument about why Ethan should spend less time with me. And now, on the single morning that mattered most, I was sitting in an airport office instead of boarding my flight. A quiet realization began to settle into place piece by piece. Like a puzzle slowly revealing its image. Melissa had always been organized. Careful. Strategic. During our marriage she used to keep color-coded folders for everything from school schedules to insurance forms. When our divorce began, that same attention to detail had shifted toward legal paperwork. She rarely did anything without planning the next 3 steps ahead. If she believed missing that hearing would help her case, she would not leave something that important to chance. I looked at the officer again. Can I ask something? He nodded. Of course. I pointed toward the report on his desk. Did my son call directly, or did someone else contact you first? The officer hesitated slightly before answering, and that small pause told me something important even before he spoke. The officer finally answered my question, but the way he shifted in his chair told me the answer was not as simple as the paperwork on his desk suggested. Your son contacted the local police line, he said slowly, but the call was transferred to us because it involved a possible attempt to leave before a custody hearing. I nodded slightly, absorbing every word. That meant Ethan had spoken to someone first before the airport officers ever got involved. The detail sat in my mind like a stone dropping into still water, sending quiet ripples through everything I thought I understood. The clock on the wall moved to 8:26. In Chicago, the courthouse doors would already be open. Lawyers would be walking through the metal detectors carrying leather briefcases and folders full of arguments. I had imagined myself walking through those same doors in less than 2 hours, standing in front of the judge and explaining why Ethan deserved a father who was present in his life. Now I was stuck in a room with fluorescent lights and a ticking clock. Did he sound upset when he called? I asked. The officer glanced again at the report. According to the notes, he sounded concerned. Said he believed you might leave before the hearing. Concerned. That word echoed strangely in my head. Ethan had never sounded concerned about me attending the hearing when we talked earlier that week. In fact, he had seemed almost relieved that I planned to be there. I remembered his exact words while we sat across from each other in the diner booth 3 nights earlier. He had looked down at his milkshake and said quietly, I hope the judge lets us keep doing weekends like this. That sentence alone told me he wanted time with both of us, not just his mother. So why would he suddenly call the police the morning of the hearing? The officer tapped the folder lightly with his pen. Did you speak with your son this morning? No, I replied. I left the house around 7:30. He was still asleep when I walked out. That was true. I had looked in on him before leaving, the same way I had done since he was a little kid. His room had been quiet, sunlight coming through the blinds, his baseball glove resting on the chair beside his desk. Everything about that moment had felt normal. Ordinary. Nothing about it suggested that 30 minutes later I would be sitting in an airport office explaining myself to law enforcement. The officer leaned back slightly. We just need to make sure there is no misunderstanding before you travel. Travel. The word felt heavier than it should have. I glanced at my phone on the table, the screen dark and silent. Normally by this time Melissa's lawyer would already be sending messages through my attorney confirming that the hearing schedule had not changed. Instead there was nothing. No updates. No warnings. Just silence. That silence began to feel less like coincidence and more like design. Melissa had spent months building a narrative about me being unreliable. Late to pick up Ethan once because traffic on the interstate stalled for 40 minutes. Forgetting to sign one school form until the next morning. Small things that became paragraphs in legal filings. If I failed to appear in court today, it would not look like a mistake. It would look like proof. The officer closed the folder halfway. We should be able to clear this up soon. I nodded again, but my eyes drifted back to the clock. 8:28. My plane would be closing its doors any minute now. And somewhere far from this airport office, a courtroom was waiting to see whether I would show up or not. I watched the clock slide to 8:31 and felt the quiet certainty settle in that my plane had already pushed back from the gate. The realization did not arrive with panic the way people might expect. Instead it arrived with a strange calm, the kind that appears when something important has already slipped out of your hands. I imagined the aircraft rolling slowly across the runway while passengers adjusted their seat belts and looked out the window at the morning sky. Somewhere inside that plane was the seat with my name on the boarding list, and somewhere far away in Chicago a judge would soon glance at the empty chair reserved for me. I folded my hands on the desk to keep them steady. Officer, I said, do you know how long this process usually takes? He looked at the clock as well before answering. It depends on how quickly we can confirm the situation. Confirm the situation. That phrase carried a weight that only people inside legal disputes truly understand. When lawyers speak, confirmation means documentation, and documentation means time. Time was the one thing I did not have. My phone buzzed suddenly on the metal desk. The sound felt louder than it should have in the quiet room. I glanced down at the screen and saw the name that mattered most right now. Laura Bennett. My attorney. For a moment I hesitated, then I looked up at the officer. May I answer that? He nodded. Go ahead. I picked up the phone and pressed accept. Daniel, Laura said immediately, her voice calm but sharp with focus. Where are you? Airport security office, I replied. Police stopped me before boarding. There was a short pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause lawyers take when they are rearranging information in their heads. Let me guess, she said slowly. Someone reported you might skip the hearing. My son, I answered. Saying the words still felt strange. Laura exhaled quietly. That is very convenient timing. I leaned slightly forward in the chair. You think this was planned? Daniel, she said, your ex-wife has been preparing for every possible angle in this case. If you fail to appear in court today, it strengthens her argument that you are unreliable. The officer across the desk pretended not to listen, but I could see from his posture that he understood the direction of the conversation. The plane already left, I said. I am not getting to Chicago in time. Laura was silent for a moment longer, then her voice returned with a different tone. Steadier one. Do not assume that yet. I frowned slightly. The flight is gone. Maybe, she replied. But the hearing is not the same thing as the flight. That sentence hung in the air between us. I glanced again at the clock. 8:34. In less than 90 minutes the courtroom session would begin. Laura, I said carefully, if I am not physically there, the judge will assume I chose not to appear. Normally, she said, that would be true. Her voice lowered slightly as if she were stepping carefully through a door she had been waiting to open. But sometimes the most important move in a legal case happens before anyone realizes the game has started. I leaned back in the chair, suddenly aware that there might be something happening behind the scenes that I did not yet understand. Laura's words stayed in my ear even after the terminal announcement echoed faintly through the hallway outside the office. Boarding for Chicago was officially closed. I did not need to hear the announcement to know that. I could feel it in the silence of my phone and the slow, steady movement of the clock on the wall. 8:37 in the morning. The officer across the desk watched me carefully as I held the phone to my ear. Laura, I said quietly, you just said something that sounded like you were not surprised by this. There was another pause on the line, the kind that happens when someone decides how much to reveal. When Laura spoke again, her voice carried the calm tone that had made her one of the best attorneys in our county. Daniel, do you remember our meeting 2 weeks ago when I told you something about patterns? I leaned forward slightly in the chair. You said Melissa had started asking very specific questions during depositions. Exactly, Laura replied. Questions about your travel plans, your schedule, your ability to appear in court personally. I remembered that conversation now. At the time I thought it was just another legal tactic. Melissa's lawyer had spent hours asking about small details that seemed meaningless. Where I worked. What hours I kept. Whether I traveled for business. You think she was setting this up? I said slowly. I think she was preparing multiple scenarios, Laura answered. And one of those scenarios involved you not making it to the courtroom. The officer shifted slightly in his chair but did not interrupt. The clock ticked to 8:39. My mind began replaying the last several months like pieces of a puzzle finally aligning. Melissa asking Ethan more questions about my schedule during pickup days. Her attorney requesting confirmation about my travel plans for the hearing. Even the way Ethan had looked slightly distracted at dinner 3 nights earlier. At the time I thought he was just thinking about school or baseball practice. Now I wondered if something else had been weighing on him. Laura, I said carefully, If they wanted me to miss the hearing, why involve Ethan? Laura's answer came without hesitation. Because nothing in court sounds more convincing than concern from a child. That sentence landed heavily in the quiet office. Concern from a child. A simple phrase that could carry enormous weight in front of a judge. The officer cleared his throat gently. Sir, I do not want to interrupt your call, but we should finish verifying this report. I nodded and covered the microphone for a moment. 1 minute, I told him before returning to the call. Laura, even if this was planned, the result is the same. I missed the flight. Yes, she said. You missed the flight. Her tone shifted again, slightly sharper now. But you did not miss the hearing. I frowned. That is not possible. I am still at the airport. Laura lowered her voice slightly, as if revealing something she had been holding back. Daniel, when a case becomes this strategic, lawyers start preparing for problems before they happen. The quiet certainty in her voice made me sit a little straighter in the chair. What exactly are you saying? I asked. There was the faint sound of papers moving on her side of the line. Then Laura said something that made the situation feel completely different. I filed a contingency motion yesterday morning. The officer raised an eyebrow slightly as he watched my expression change. A contingency motion for what? I asked. Laura's answer came calmly, almost casually, but the meaning behind it changed everything about the morning I thought I was losing. For a moment I did not say anything. The words contingency motion hung in the air like a door opening in a hallway I did not even know existed. The clock on the wall clicked to 8:40. 2. Outside the office I could hear the distant rolling of suitcase wheels and the muffled voice of another airport announcement, but inside the room everything felt still. Laura, I said slowly, what kind of contingency motion are we talking about? Papers shifted on her end of the call. I could almost picture her standing at her desk in Chicago, glasses resting low on her nose while she reviewed documents. A motion requesting the court allow remote testimony if circumstances outside your control prevented travel, she explained. I blinked. Remote testimony? You mean appearing without physically being in the courtroom? Exactly, she said. Video appearance. It is not common for custody hearings, but it is permitted when justified. The officer across the desk looked up slightly when he heard the word remote, though he still pretended to focus on his paperwork. I leaned forward in my chair. And the judge approved that? Not exactly, Laura replied calmly. The motion simply created the option. The judge said it would be considered if necessary. My eyes moved back to the clock. 8:43. Laura, I said. Necessary seems like a pretty good word for this situation. She gave a quiet sound that almost resembled a laugh. That was my thinking as well. The realization began to unfold slowly in my mind. Melissa's strategy depended on something very specific. She needed me to miss the hearing completely. Not late. Not delayed. Completely absent. Because absence could be framed as irresponsibility. But appearing by video changed the story entirely. I looked at the officer again. How long until you finish verifying this report? He checked the paperwork and spoke carefully. We are waiting on confirmation from the department that received the call. Confirmation. Another word that meant time. I lifted the phone again. Laura, if the judge allows it, how would the video appearance work? Very simply, she said. You connect to the courtroom session from wherever you are. The judge sees you, hears you, and you testify exactly as if you were present. The thought felt strange. Instead of walking into the courthouse in Chicago, I might be speaking to the judge from an airport security office hundreds of miles away. Yet the more I considered it, the clearer the picture became. Melissa expected an empty chair. She did not expect a live video screen. The officer suddenly raised his hand slightly. Sir, I just received a message. He read the notification on his tablet for a moment. The initial call was logged through local dispatch. Your son reported concern that you might not attend your hearing. His tone remained neutral. There is no indication of any threat or criminal activity. I nodded slowly. That meant they had no legal reason to keep me much longer. The officer continued. We just need a few more details and then you will be free to go. Free to go. The phrase carried a different meaning now than it had 30 minutes earlier. I glanced again at the clock. 8:46. Somewhere in Chicago the courthouse would soon begin calling cases for the morning docket. I lifted the phone back to my ear. Laura, I said quietly. How long until the hearing starts? 1 hour and 14 minutes. She answered immediately. I sat back in the chair and took a slow breath. 1 hour earlier I thought everything was collapsing. Now it felt like something else was happening entirely, something that Melissa had not expected. Because instead of disappearing from the hearing the way she planned, I might still appear after all. Just not in the way anyone in that courtroom was prepared for. The officer finished typing something into his tablet, and then looked up at me with a calmer expression than before. All right, Mr. Carter, he said. It looks like there was simply a concern raised about whether you intended to appear in court today. There's no indication of any violation. The words should have felt like relief, but relief was not the first thing that crossed my mind. The first thing I noticed was the clock. 8:49 in the morning. Every minute now had a different kind of value than it did earlier. Earlier I thought the morning was collapsing. Now it felt like time had been bent slightly in my favor. I nodded politely. So I am free to leave? The officer gave a small nod. Yes, sir. We apologize for the inconvenience. Inconvenience. The word sounded strangely small compared to the storm that had been building in my mind for the last 40 minutes. I stood up slowly, picking up my phone from the desk. Laura was still on the line. Daniel, she said quietly. What just happened? They confirmed the report, I replied. But there is nothing they can hold me for. I am leaving the office now. I walked out of the small room and back into the bright noise of the terminal. Travelers moved past me carrying backpacks and coffee cups while departure boards flickered with rows of destinations. My plane to Chicago had already disappeared from the screen. I paused beside a row of empty seats near the gate and looked out the large glass windows toward the runway. The aircraft that should have carried me was already gone. For a moment I simply stood there watching another plane taxi slowly toward takeoff. Daniel, Laura said again, bringing my attention back to the call. Do not worry about the flight. I am not, I answered quietly. And to my own surprise I realized it was true. 40 minutes earlier missing that flight felt like the end of everything. Now it felt like something else entirely. Something Melissa had not accounted for. The court session begins at 10 o'clock. Laura continued. I have already notified the clerk that you may appear remotely if necessary. I looked around the terminal, thinking quickly. How stable does the connection need to be? Laura answered immediately. Clear audio and video. That is all the judge requires. I glanced across the airport hall and noticed a quiet business lounge area near the corner of the terminal. A few travelers sat there with laptops open while charging stations lined the wall beneath large windows. It was quiet enough that a conversation could happen without interruption. I think I found the place, I said. I walked toward the lounge while the sounds of the terminal faded slightly behind me. My shoes echoed softly across the polished floor as I moved past a row of vending machines and empty seating. When I reached the lounge I sat down at a small table beside a power outlet and placed my phone on the surface in front of me. Laura, I said calmly, tell me exactly what happens next. She did not hesitate. In 1 hour the judge will call the case. Melissa and her lawyer will expect an empty chair where you should be sitting. I leaned back slightly in the chair and looked out the window at the wide morning sky above the runway. But instead, she continued, the clerk will activate the remote connection. The image formed clearly in my mind now. A courtroom in Chicago. A judge reviewing the docket. Melissa sitting beside her attorney, confident that the story she planned was about to unfold. Laura, I said quietly, I think they are about to be very surprised. I sat in the quiet corner of the airport lounge with my phone resting against my briefcase, angled carefully so the camera would capture my face and the small space around me. The hum of the terminal continued in the distance, but here the noise was softer, almost like background static. The large windows beside me looked out across the runway where planes lifted slowly into the pale morning sky. 10 minutes earlier that view would have filled me with frustration. Now it felt strangely steady, like a reminder that things keep moving forward even when plans shift unexpectedly. My phone vibrated once on the table. A message from Laura appeared on the screen. The clerk has opened the virtual session. Be ready in 20 minutes. I checked the time again. 9:39. The hearing would begin at 10 o'clock. I adjusted the phone slightly, making sure the camera angle was stable. The business lounge around me remained quiet, only a few travelers typing on laptops or speaking softly into headsets. None of them knew that a courtroom hundreds of miles away was about to appear on the screen in front of me. I leaned back in the chair and let my thoughts settle. Melissa had spent months building a narrative. She had painted a picture of me as distracted, unreliable, always one step away from failing to show up when it mattered most. Missing this hearing had probably been the final brushstroke she needed to finish that portrait. I imagined her sitting in the courtroom beside her attorney right now. Her folder neatly arranged on the table. Her expression calm. Confident. The kind of confidence that comes from believing the outcome has already been decided. My phone vibrated again. This time Laura's voice came through as she joined the call. Daniel, can you hear me clearly? Yes, I answered. The screen shifted slightly as she adjusted her camera. Behind her I could see the familiar wood paneling of the courthouse conference room. Good, she said. The judge will begin the docket in a few minutes. When our case is called, the clerk will activate your connection. I nodded. Slowly. Do they know I am appearing remotely? Laura smiled faintly. Only the judge and the clerk. That detail carried a quiet satisfaction. Melissa and her attorney would not expect a video screen to come to life beside the courtroom bench. They would expect silence where my voice should be. I looked down briefly at the reflection in the phone screen, making sure my tie was straight and the lighting was clear. It felt unusual preparing for a custody hearing while sitting beside an airport window, but the seriousness of the moment remained exactly the same. My future with Ethan would still be decided in the next hour. The only difference was the path that led here. The phone chimed again and a notification appeared across the screen. Court session beginning. Laura's voice lowered slightly. All right, Daniel. Stay calm. Answer clearly. Let the judge guide the conversation. I nodded once more, feeling the same steady focus I used to feel before important presentations at work. Across the runway another aircraft lifted into the sky, its engines humming softly through the glass. At the same time the screen on my phone shifted and a new window opened. Rows of wooden benches appeared. A raised bench at the front of the courtroom. A judge reviewing documents. And just to the side of the room, two familiar figures sitting at a table. Melissa and her attorney were already there, speaking quietly to each other. Neither of them had noticed the small video window that had just come to life. The courtroom audio grew clearer through my phone speaker as the clerk began calling the morning docket. Papers moved across desks and quiet conversations faded as people took their seats. I watched the small screen carefully, my hands resting calmly on the table in front of me. From my seat in the airport lounge I could see everything inside that room almost as if I were sitting there myself. The judge adjusted a pair of reading glasses and glanced down at the case list in front of him. One by one, names were called and lawyers stepped forward to speak. Each case lasted only a few minutes. Routine matters. Short motions. Administrative decisions. Meanwhile Melissa sat at the table beside her attorney, flipping slowly through a stack of documents. Every so often she leaned closer to him and whispered something. Her expression looked confident, relaxed even. From the way she occasionally glanced toward the empty chair across the aisle, it was clear she expected it to remain empty. I imagined the story she believed was about to unfold. When our case was called, her lawyer would stand and explain that I had failed to appear. He would use calm professional language, the kind that makes absence sound intentional instead of unfortunate. He would say that my absence reflected the same pattern he had described in previous filings. Unreliable. Distracted. Not fully committed. The kind of father who might promise something and then fail to follow through. The narrative would sound convincing because the most important piece of evidence would be visible to everyone in the room. An empty chair. My phone vibrated softly as Laura sent a message through the chat window. Stay ready. The clerk will activate you when the judge calls the case. I nodded slightly even though she could not see me yet. Outside the large windows beside me another plane climbed slowly into the sky, its white body reflecting the morning sunlight. The steady movement of the airport around me felt almost surreal compared to the quiet tension building inside that courtroom screen. The judge finished reviewing the previous case and turned another page on the docket. Next matter, the clerk announced clearly. My attention sharpened instantly. The judge read the file name aloud. Carter vs. Carter. Custody review. Melissa's attorney stood smoothly from his chair. Melissa remained seated but lifted her chin slightly, the expression on her face calm and certain. The attorney stepped forward and spoke in a measured voice. Your Honor, we are prepared to proceed. The judge looked around the courtroom briefly. Is Mr. Carter present? The silence lasted only a second, but in that second I could see Melissa's attorney preparing to speak again. The words were already forming on his lips. I imagined the sentence exactly the way he planned to say it. Your Honor, it appears the petitioner has failed to appear today. But before he could finish that thought, the clerk leaned forward and pressed a key on the desk beside the judge. The courtroom monitor lit up instantly. My image appeared on the screen beside the bench. For a brief moment no one spoke. Melissa's attorney stopped mid-sentence. Melissa's head turned sharply toward the monitor. And from my quiet seat inside the airport lounge hundreds of miles away, I looked directly into the courtroom camera and said calmly, Good morning, Your Honor. Daniel Carter present. For a brief second the entire courtroom froze in silence. Melissa's attorney was still standing beside the table, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the desk as if he had paused in the middle of a sentence that suddenly no longer fit the situation. Melissa turned fully toward the courtroom monitor, her expression shifting from calm confidence to something much harder to read. The judge leaned slightly forward, studying the screen where my image now appeared clearly beside the bench. Mr. Carter, the judge said in a measured tone, I understand you are appearing remotely this morning. Yes, Your Honor, I answered calmly. Due to an unexpected situation at the airport earlier today, my attorney filed a contingency request allowing me to appear through video if necessary. The judge nodded slowly, clearly aware of the motion Laura had submitted. Very well. The court will proceed. From my seat in the airport lounge I could see Laura standing beside the counsel table inside the courtroom. She gave a small professional nod toward the bench before speaking. Your Honor, Mr. Carter intended to travel to Chicago this morning to attend this hearing in person. However, a report was filed earlier today that temporarily delayed his travel at the airport. The judge looked down briefly at the file in front of him. I have reviewed the motion your office submitted yesterday regarding potential travel complications. Laura continued calmly. Yes, Your Honor. Given the circumstances, Mr. Carter is prepared to participate fully through the remote connection. The judge looked back up at the monitor where I was seated. Mr. Carter, can you confirm that you are able to hear the proceedings clearly? Yes, Your Honor, I replied. The connection is clear. The judge nodded once more and turned slightly toward Melissa's attorney. Counsel, do you have any objection to proceeding in this manner? For the first time since the hearing began, Melissa's attorney hesitated. The confident rhythm he had shown only moments earlier seemed slightly disrupted. He glanced briefly toward Melissa before answering. No objection, Your Honor. The judge placed both hands calmly on the desk in front of him. Very well. The court will proceed with the hearing. From my position in the airport lounge, I noticed Melissa's posture had changed. She was sitting straighter now, her hands folded tightly on the table in front of her. Whatever narrative she expected to unfold had clearly shifted the moment the screen activated. Laura began presenting the opening summary of our position, her voice steady and precise. She spoke about the importance of stability for Ethan, about the consistent involvement I had maintained in his life, and about the importance of ensuring both parents remained active in his upbringing. As she spoke, I watched the courtroom carefully through the phone screen. The judge listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in the file before him. Melissa's attorney reviewed his own documents quietly, preparing to respond when his turn came. Yet something about the room had changed. The empty chair that was supposed to tell one story had been replaced by something else entirely. Instead of absence, there was presence. Instead of silence, there was a voice. The judge eventually looked up from his notes again. "Mr. Carter," he said, directing the attention of the courtroom back toward the monitor. "Before we continue, the court would like to hear directly from you regarding the events that delayed your travel this morning." I straightened slightly in my chair beside the airport window, the bright morning sky reflecting across the screen as I prepared to answer. For a brief moment I did not answer immediately. I simply looked at the screen where the judge waited patiently, his hands folded on the bench while the courtroom remained quiet. Melissa sat beside her attorney, her posture rigid now, the earlier confidence replaced by careful attention. The judge repeated his question calmly. "Mr. Carter, please explain what happened this morning that delayed your arrival." I took a slow breath and leaned slightly closer to the camera. "Your Honor, I arrived at the airport early this morning to board my flight to Chicago. My intention was to attend this hearing in person, as I have attended every other required proceeding in this case." The judge nodded slightly for me to continue. "However," I said, choosing my words carefully, "airport officers stopped me shortly before boarding after receiving a report that I might attempt to leave before the hearing." I could see Melissa's attorney glance briefly toward her when I said that. The judge lifted his eyebrows slightly. "And who filed that report?" The courtroom became very still. I did not raise my voice. I simply answered the question the way the officer had explained it earlier. "According to the report, Your Honor, the call was made by my son." The judge looked down at the file again while making a short note. "I see." Laura stepped forward slightly. "Your Honor, the airport officers quickly confirmed there was no violation or threat involved. Mr. Carter was released shortly afterward, but by that time his flight had already departed." The judge nodded again and turned his attention back to the monitor where I sat. "Mr. Carter, did you make any statement suggesting you intended to avoid this hearing?" "No, Your Honor," I replied calmly. "In fact, 3 days ago I explained to my son that I would be flying here specifically so I could attend this hearing in person." The judge leaned back slightly in his chair, clearly considering the information. The quiet inside the courtroom seemed to stretch for several seconds. Finally he spoke again. "The court recognizes that unexpected circumstances can occasionally interfere with travel plans." His tone remained measured, but there was a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. "However, the court also notes that Mr. Carter took reasonable steps to remain present through remote appearance." Laura nodded respectfully. Melissa's attorney adjusted his papers but did not interrupt. The judge continued reviewing the file in front of him. "Mr. Carter," he said after a moment, "the fact that you remained available and prepared to participate despite the delay reflects a level of responsibility the court takes seriously." I simply nodded once. "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge turned briefly toward Melissa's attorney. "Counsel, does your client wish to address the circumstances of this report?" For the first time since the hearing began, Melissa looked slightly uncertain. Her attorney leaned toward her for a moment, whispering quietly before standing again. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "my client had no intention of interfering with the proceedings. She was not aware of the specific timing of the report." The judge listened but did not immediately respond. Instead, he closed the file in front of him and rested his hands calmly on the desk. "Very well," he said. "The court will focus on the primary matter before us, which is the welfare and stability of the child involved." The attention of the courtroom shifted back toward the central issue of the hearing. But from my seat beside the airport window, one thing had already become clear. The story that was supposed to begin with my absence had just begun in a very different way. I remained still for a moment after the judge finished speaking, letting the quiet settle across the courtroom and the airport lounge at the same time. Through the phone screen I could see the judge reviewing his notes carefully while both attorneys waited. Outside the window beside me another aircraft lifted from the runway, climbing steadily into the bright morning sky. The movement felt symbolic somehow, like the moment when tension finally begins to release. The judge looked up again and spoke in the same calm tone he had used throughout the hearing. The court's responsibility is to determine what arrangement best serves the long-term stability and well-being of the child. His gaze moved briefly between the two tables in front of him. Both parents have expressed a desire to remain active in the child's life. Laura stood quietly beside the counsel table, listening without interruption. Melissa remained seated beside her attorney, her hands folded together, as she watched the judge closely. The earlier certainty she carried into the courtroom had clearly faded. The judge continued reviewing the file before him. In recent months there have been several disagreements between the parties regarding scheduling, communication, and travel arrangements. However, the court is also considering the consistency each parent has demonstrated in maintaining a relationship with the child. He paused briefly before continuing. This morning's circumstances are a useful example. My attention sharpened slightly at those words. The judge glanced toward the monitor where I appeared on the screen. Mr. Carter attempted to travel to this hearing in person. When an unexpected delay prevented that travel, he remained present through remote participation rather than abandoning the proceeding. The judge then turned toward Melissa's side of the courtroom. The court expects both parents to encourage clear communication and cooperation moving forward. The room remained silent as he closed the file in front of him. At this time the court will maintain the existing shared custody structure with additional provisions designed to improve scheduling clarity between both households. Laura nodded respectfully. Melissa's attorney listened carefully as the judge outlined the updated conditions. The adjustments were practical ones. Clearer visitation schedules. Structured communication regarding travel and school activities. Nothing dramatic, but enough to remove the confusion that had fueled months of arguments. When the judge finished speaking, he looked once more toward the courtroom monitor. Mr. Carter, he said, the court appreciates your effort to remain present today despite the travel interruption. I inclined my head slightly. Thank you, Your Honor. The judge gathered the documents in front of him and spoke the final words that closed the hearing. This matter is concluded. The screen shifted as the clerk began closing the session. Laura looked briefly toward the camera and gave a small reassuring nod before the connection faded. Suddenly the courtroom disappeared from the screen and the quiet airport lounge returned to focus around me. For a few seconds I simply sat there, listening to the distant announcements echo across the terminal. The morning that had started with uncertainty had ended in a completely different place. Not because everything was perfect, but because the truth had remained visible when it mattered most. I picked up my phone from the table and looked out through the wide glass windows again. The sky above the runway stretched clear and open, and for the first time that morning I felt the weight of the situation lift slightly. Somewhere across the city Ethan was probably finishing another ordinary school day, unaware of how close the story of his family had come to changing direction. And as I stood up from the chair in the quiet airport lounge, one thing felt absolutely certain. Showing up, no matter how difficult the path becomes, still matters more than anything else.